welcome to Charity Champions, the podcast where we hear from leaders shaping real change across the not-for-profit and charitable sectors. I'm your host, Emily Formby from Charity Recruit. Today, I'm joined by Will Snell, Chief Executive of Fairness Foundation, a UK-based advocacy and public policy organisation tackling inequality head-on. Will has led a fascinating and varied career, from international development and government to founding and running NGOs focused on social justice. In this conversation, we'll explore what it means to lead organisations that influence systems rather than deliver services, and why fairness is not just a value, but a strategy for long-term societal change. We'll also talk about the difference between executive and governance leadership, how to lead with both care and challenge, and what the future of fairness could look like in the UK. So here we go. Welcome, Will. Nice to have you on our podcast today.
Thanks, Emily. Great to be here.
Oh, good. I'm really glad that you're here. Let's start with your perspective on different types of non-for-profit leadership. As I said, you've worked across the spectrum. You've done policy, campaigning and delivery. What's the difference, or what's different, I guess, about leading an advocacy-based organisation like the Fairness Foundation compared with running a service delivery charity?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I should say at the start that I've never run or even worked for a really kind of nuts and bolts service delivery organisation. So the closest I've got has been organisations that are delivering, for example, mentoring support, or in one recent example, running behaviour change campaigns. So, you know, it's not really service delivery, but I suppose it is programmatic work in a sense.
Yeah.
And I think the obvious difference that struck me as I moved across about 10 years ago into more policy advocacy work was the difficulty of measuring impact when you're trying to change policies and underlying systems, rather than, you know, either deliver services or in the case of some projects to change behaviours, for example, which itself is not easy to measure at all, but it's possible to design evaluation strategies that can give you a pretty good idea of the extent to which you're delivering what you're trying to achieve, changing those behaviours, and the sort of various points along the theory of change that lead up to it in terms of tracking outputs and so on that get you there. I think what I've found as you move into, or rather as I've moved into policy advocacy work, is not only is it harder to get a sense of the extent to which your outputs are translating into outcomes, but also even if you can measure those outcomes, which often are around changing policy, you know, you just don't have a sense unless you're working on something very, very niche and you're literally the only player in that space, of the extent to which the contribution is down to your efforts as opposed to those of others. And of course, you know, in the vast majority of cases, the game is about working in partnership with others, and, you know, you're stronger together. You don't want to be you know, ploughing your own furrows. So it's really a challenge, I think, for lots of organisations who are working on policy and advocacy to show their unique impact. And of course, that has implications in terms of demonstrating impact to funders and getting the money in to continue working. So that is another area of difference, I think, is that to generalise, it's often even more difficult perhaps for policy advocacy organisations to secure the necessary funding that they need to do their work, and that is in part because of the difficulty of showing impact.
So what kind of tools do you have in place to measure that impact?
Well, I mean, the easy thing to do, of course, is to measure your output. So it's to measure how many reports you've published and how many MPs you've met and all these sorts of things. And I mean, as with anything, I think, you know, there are ways of doing that intelligently and usefully, and ways of doing it in a more tick boxy way that don't necessarily deliver much insight. And I think what I've come to realise is that it is really important to make sure that you're measuring those outputs, but to be a bit nuanced about it, and not to be too quantitative, if you like, but to think more about the qualitative. You know, it's almost a kind of quality rather than quantity type exercise. So thinking about, you know, media coverage or social media impressions or meetings with MPs or whatever else it is that you think is important. It's not just about raw numbers. It's about, are you getting the coverage in the right places to influence your target audience? Are you meeting the right MPs? Are you getting the meetings with the government ministers? And are you getting do you have good relationships? So there's lots of qualitative and often subjective judgments that need to be made. But that's the sort of the substance that needs to be in there, I think, in order to kind of get a sense of, these are the points on our kind of theory of change that lead us to the sort of impact we want to deliver. Can we kind of sorry, I'm lost my train of thought. Can we make a good case that it's at least plausible that we're delivering the impact we see in terms of our ability to deliver those kind of intermediate outputs? And then, of course, whether you can then measure what you're trying to achieve as a kind of ultimate goal, and also how much you as an organization have contributed to that. That depends on what you're trying to achieve, and it might be something very obvious, like you're trying to get a piece of legislation changed, which either has or hasn't happened. But often it's more complicated.
So from a management point of view, going into lead an organization like that, you've had to change your approach and manage your expectations for how you're measuring success. How's that translated in your style of managing a team, would you say?
I think it does require you to be a bit more, well, I suppose more flexible, but also, I think that there are lots of commonalities with leading a team in a policy advocacy organisation compared to any other non-profit, and I think to a large extent in for-profits as well. I think you need to be able to deliver, sort of level 5 leadership, if you like. You need to be able to influence people in ways that go beyond your kind of direct top-down command and control, and that I think applies just as much in a policy organization as it does in a service delivery one. But it's certainly, I've had to adapt in terms of recruiting and managing different sorts of people. So for me, it was moving into running what's effectively a think tank. It was a big learning curve in terms of how do you recruit and manage politics people, so public affairs specialists. I'd never worked with them before, particularly researchers, very different skill sets from the sorts of people I've been working with in previous roles who've been doing strategy and business development and project management and all those sorts of things. So it
what
definitely
were the biggest
requires
differences then, do you feel?
But in terms of the sorts of people that need to be recruited into those organizations?
Absolutely.
I mean, so this is particular to the sort of work we're doing, which is very small p political. I mean, so we're a charity, right? So we are obviously not aligned to any particular party. So we are politically neutral in a big P sense, but in a small p sense, we are operating in the politics sector, in the industry of politics. That's where we are engaging. And so for me, it was very new to be recruiting and working with people whose blood is all about politics. We're going to the big party conferences every year and all those sorts of things. And again, of course, that has an implication for the sorts of people that are brought into your mission, including funders, that there are groups of funders and other supporters who might not want to engage or might be less willing to engage because we're coming from a particular position, compared to the sorts of programmatic or service delivery work where as long as you can prove that what you're doing is effective and cost effective, someone's political persuasion doesn't really have a bearing on the extent to which they want to support your work.
No. So looking at it from a funding point of view, you mentioned earlier the differences or the challenges when you're reporting your outcomes for funders. How does that change? What's your insight on that?
So, I mean, we've been lucky at the Fairness Foundation in having a main funder who is very much bought into our mission, which is Julian Richer, who co-founded it with me 4 years ago. And so we are unusual in being able to rely on having the majority of our funding in unrestricted core funding.
Right.
the sector in which I work, which is broadly called the New Economy movement, so it's organisations trying to reform the economy in a broadly progressive direction, is going through a real funding pinch at the moment. There's always been a very small number of organisations who are active in funding in this space. That has shrunk over the last year or two.
Right.
It's very hard to get new people in new organisations funding in it. It's also historically been reliant on, to some extent, on US funding as well. Much of which has dried up. So it's a really challenging environment, actually. And to the extent that this is a sector that's trying to hold the rich and powerful to account, that obviously makes it harder in terms of looking to raise money from high net worth individuals, for example, a subset of whom are very supportive, but the majority of whom might at least initially feel that their interests are threatened by this agenda rather than furthered by it.
Right, okay. So how do you overcome that? What's the strategy for managing that?
Well, I think it's really around identifying and building relationships with that minority of people with those sorts of backgrounds who recognise the need for this kind of work and are willing to support it. And I think we're helped by the fact that we are trying to build bridges across the political divide. So we're not coming across as being kind of overtly progressive, shall we say. We're very much trying to say, look, this is the agenda we work on, which is really around socio-economic inequality in the UK, is one that should be of interest to and concern people from a wide variety of political persuasions because of the way in which it's impacting on growth and faith in democracy and so on, and that we need to build that consensus of concern and action.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that it's all coming back to what you said in the initial question. It's all about delivery. It's all about that communication piece, isn't it, and holding those relationships and showing your credibility throughout that process. And that's something that's really important from developing those relationships with the funders, but equally as important when you're managing your team, that you've got that visibility and that openness and transparency across both things, really. So I think being a leader in the sector, that communication piece has got to be at the top of the table, hasn't it? So I know when we'd spoken in our prep call, we talked about, you've been both a CEO and a chair, and we talked about your experience of stepping back into that chair role at Tax Justice UK, which was quite unusual. What are the differences in your view, between that CEO and that chair role?
Yeah, so as you say, when I set up Tax Justice UK about almost 9 years ago now, unbelievable. Wow. And yeah, I slightly unusually decided to step back quite quickly from being the kind of front person, the exec director, really because I don't see myself as a campaigner, and it became clear to me quite quickly that what that role required, running this new organisation, which is really about campaigning for a fairer tax system in the UK, was someone with that kind of very campaigning personality. And so I hired someone in and then stepped back to chair the board for the next 6 years or so. And yeah, and I think, clearly you're chairing a startup organisation, which at that point was 1 paid member of staff, and then quite quickly 2. It's now 8 or 9, but for the majority of the time I was there was sort of 5 or 6 people. Right. Was very much more that, the kind of classic non-exec, and in particular the chair role of line managing the director or chief exec, being that enabler, the coach, mentor, all those things wrapped into one, the support, but also the challenge function. And yeah, I think in some ways, for me, it was easier to transition into that function, having spent such a short time doing the day-to-day work, compared to, I think, to your more common, scenario where someone is maybe stepping back to a board role, perhaps including a chair role, after 10, 15, 20 years of leading an organisation, where I think, there's much more of a challenge in terms of making that transition and unlearning all those things that have been learned over so many years and so on. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So in that scenario, when you decided to step back into that, well, I say step back, it's not really a step back, is it? It's a step into the chair role from the CEO role. What was the sort of
I get it that you needed to bring in somebody who was more from a campaigning point of view, but why not a head of or a, campaign lead, and you remain in the operational CEO role? What was the reason for moving into the chair role?
I think that it was clear that it needed to become a campaigning-led organisation. So it wasn't kind of campaigning as a sort of subset of a broader set of issues.
Right.
It needed to be someone leading it who was doing that, and that also that because money was tight, we needed to make sure that campaigns was the first hire, comms was the second, and so on and so forth, rather than having me almost there to justify my own salary.
Yeah, I understand.
Which was that. Well, actually, two other thoughts. One was that, I mean, after no, but while I was still at university, I was involved in co-founding a educational charity working in sub-Saharan Africa. And that was an interesting example of a very different kind of board role where there are no paid staff, and in fact, hardly any volunteers other than the trustees.
Oh, right, okay.
And so you have a situation where the trustees are not only carrying out the kind of classic board roles within the organisation, but are also doing all the day-to-day work.
Right. What did you study at uni, Will?
History, so unrelated.
Oh wow! I hadn't realised that you'd started, your not-for-profit career and your exposure in the sector right back when you started at uni. Talk us through how that all came about.
So I spent some time volunteering in Kenya when I was on a year out between school and uni, and then basically stayed involved in working with these communities and setting up a charity to raise money in the UK and to oversee construction projects at some of these schools, and set up a board which mostly was composed of people who were retired surveyors and teachers and administrators, and then the two of us who were kind of 19-year-old students. So there was an interesting mix of perspectives and cultures, and of course a diversity of experience and age on that board. But again, it was a very different kind of organisation. Because the role as board members was to do all the work, all the fundraising, all the project management, and so on and so forth, as well as the governance and the accountability and strategy.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, how did you manage to get the buy-in from those individuals at such a young age, with this vision that you had? Talk me through how you even identified who you wanted to work with, and then how you got them involved.
So a lot of it was to do with networks of people who had been involved in some way or other with that region of the world.
Right.
And I think, we were very young, but we had spent 6-9 months, sort of doing the work in that country, and therefore we sort of knew something about what we were trying to achieve, albeit that we'd gone in very, very green. But there was some level of credibility there around having at least had some exposure to the issues and the communities that we were trying to help.
Right.
But it was definitely a learning experience.
Yeah, I bet.
And I think in a way, having then, for me, I found it quite difficult to move on to work to being a trustee on more conventional boards of more established charities, where of course you are, just providing that governance function and are very much not looking to get involved in the day-to-day running of the organisation. So that was a useful learning transition.
Yeah, I bet, because I mean that's the majority of the charities that you deal with have that governance board, don't they, that are very hands-off, looking at it from a strategic point of view and leaving the operational side to the paid team.
Yeah.
So going from that university setting where you're very, very hands-on and operational, that must have been a massive learning curve.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's these sorts of transitions are common, aren't they? And going back to your kind of classic scenario where you've got a founding chief exec who perhaps steps back either into a board role or steps away completely after 10-20 years. You often find you've got that kind of classic entrepreneur type who does the setting up, and then you've got perhaps more of a kind of manager who comes in and takes it on to the next stage. And so I suppose we didn't have that particularly, but that feels like a very common trajectory as well.
Absolutely. Would you describe yourself as an entrepreneur?
Yes and no. I think I have some entrepreneurial traits.
Right.
But I've also worked in organizations where I've been the kind of classic foil to the entrepreneurial leader, sometimes
Right.
providing that kind of the sort of second pair of eyes, the the word of caution. So I think
Yeah.
I'm a bit on the fence on that, which I think can be helpful in some respects, but I think sometimes being that kind of classic, very driven and sort of self-confident entrepreneur can be quite useful when you're starting things up.
Well, absolutely, and you've set up many a thing, so it's obviously got you, a great background, good grounding, and got you to where you are now, which is brilliant. So, just coming on to the next sort of topic, I know we discussed when we were doing our prep call for this. We were looking at sort of fairness, and it's a powerful word, but it's also a broad word. How do you define it in the work that you do, particularly in relation to tackling structural inequality?
Yeah, so when I set up the Fairness Foundation in 2021, it was in conversation with Julian Richer of Richer Sounds, who was our chair and primary funder, and it was actually his idea to set something up that was focused on fairness. And so I spent a few months helping him to scope this out and think it through. And the first question in my mind was, well, what's this idea of fairness that has this kind of potential, which we both felt, I think, to bring people together, in particular
Right.
from different political perspectives and backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's lots of literature around this, which I had been completely unaware of until this point.
Right.
Um, Around the ways in which various ideas or aspects of fairness are kind of hardwired into our sort of evolutionary psychology, effectively. So the idea of reciprocity, that you give but you also take, that we all contribute, we all share, and so on, and the idea that everyone's basic needs should be met, but at the same time that hard work should be rewarded, and that there's some sense of sort of fair process, fair opportunity, and all those sorts of things. But of course, sometimes these things can be in tension. So what we did was to come up with a way of thinking about fairness, which we call the fair necessities, which has got 5 components that sometimes in some scenarios might be in tension, but the framework allows you to kind of trade them off. But in a general sense, are all sort of compatible with each other,
Right.
which are these ideas of fair essentials, that everyone has the basics, fair opportunities, that everyone has genuinely equal opportunities to thrive. People are fairly rewarded, that there's fair exchange, so people are contributing to society, but also being supported by it when they need it.
Right.
And finally, the idea that everyone is treated equally in terms of sort of status and respect.
Right.
So that's how we think about fairness, and we think about fairness as something that is made almost impossible to achieve by very high levels of inequality.
Right.
Basically, that you can't have equal opportunities when you have very unequal outcomes, and therefore that while we're not arguing that there should be perfect equality by any stretch of the imagination, we do think that we need to dramatically reduce inequality from the current high levels that we have in the UK and other countries in order to deliver a fairer society. And so we're thinking there in particular around social and economic inequality, so income and wealth, but also about the ways in which that then bleeds into and interacts with other forms of inequality, whether that's around race or gender, region, and various other forms as well.
So what kind of things are you sort of looking at within that? What are you campaigning for, or how are you going about the campaigning, I guess, is the question.
So what we're looking to do is to raise the kind of political awareness of socioeconomic inequality in particular.
Right.
Excuse me. And focusing right now on wealth inequality. So we recently reproduced a report that looks at the ways in which wealth inequality is undermining our society, economy, democracy,
right.
And what we can do about it. And we've literally come up with a kind of 45 different ways in which it's damaging those things, and
wow,
33 things we can do about it. And these are all government policy changes. So how can we tax wealth more effectively? How can we spread wealth more broadly across society early on, rather than just relying on the tax system to do it afterwards, if you like? How can we reduce the influence of wealth on politics, to sort of try and tackle some of the the sort of feedback loop effects that keep wealth inequality high, those sorts of things. And this year we're looking in particular at how we differentiate between creating wealth and extracting wealth.
Right.
So celebrating the kind of entrepreneurs who are building new wealth, but also pointing out where certain sorts of practices are more about effectively extracting wealth from the economy without benefiting society as a whole.
Right, I see. And what going forward, how is that going to change things? You know, what's the vision for that?
Well, the vision is that we're trying to change, a broad set of, or help to build momentum for changing a broad set of policies across the range of issues I've described, but also to change the kind of narrative, if you like, to change the conversation around how we think about fairness, how we think about inequality, the extent to which we think about inequality as a problem, and also tackling some of the kind of meta narratives that act as barriers to change. So in particular, challenging the kind of myth of meritocracy, the idea that we live in a meritocratic society, that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you can make it if you try, and that by implication, if you haven't made it, then it's because you haven't tried and you sort of deserve it. So really trying to challenge these conceptions that we all, I think most of us know are rubbish, but that still somehow are kind of infect our collective psyche, because actually to do that, that's necessary in order to, I think, to enable some of these broader changes to be made.
So you mentioned the actionables there. Did you say there were 33 actionables that you've outlined?
Yeah, the last count I think it was 33.
So you're going to give us a flavour of what they might be, or do we need to go and do our research on that?
Happy to, yeah. I mean, they're all on the website, which is called the Wealth Gap Risk Register.
Okay.
But I mean, they basically fall into three buckets.
Right.
So the first of them is about taxing wealth more. So we were campaigning for lots of these changes at the last budget, but the majority of them didn't happen.
Right.
I mean, obviously there's been this debate around a wealth tax, so a new tax on stocks of wealth. We think there is merit in that, but that actually there's lots of things you can do to the existing tax system before you need to introduce a new tax. So ways in which you can tax capital gains, for example. You can change both the rate but also the sort of base of what you're taxing around that in ways that will raise more revenue and be fairer and actually improve growth at the same time as reducing inequality. Then the second bucket is around how do you spread wealth more broadly across society in the first place, which is sometimes called pre-distribution as opposed to redistribution, which is a terrible word, but no one has yet thought of an alternative. And that's really about things like how do you get more money into workers' pockets?
Right.
So how do you ensure that more profits go to workers as opposed to shareholders and executives and so on. And so that's things like how do you improve collective bargaining? Can you get worker representatives onto boards? Those sorts of things.
I see.
And but lots of other things as well. And then the third bucket is around how do you reduce the importance of either owning wealth or not owning wealth on people's life chances and outcomes.
Right.
So it's partly about investing in public services and social security so that you're less reliant on private wealth to have a reasonable quality of life, but also around reducing the extent to which having wealth enables you to influence democracy. So, for example, capping donations to political parties by individuals.
Oh, right. Okay. So lots of things to be having a look on. So in our show notes at the end, we'll put a link to your website so people can go on and have a look at those should they wish.
Fantastic.
So the other thing that we'd spoken about was sort of leadership, so leading with care and challenge, which I know can be difficult, really. I mean, internally, you've led and grown teams and helped build new organisations. What's your approach to balancing that sort of care and challenge when you're managing people?
So, I mean, I think I try and balance the two in the sort of way that you might expect. But my reflection is that certainly in the sector in which I'm working at the moment, so the kind of progressive policy advocacy space, I do think there is I think there's increasingly a shared recognition among people running these sorts of organizations that the culture has moved perhaps a little bit too much towards care and support at the expense of challenge.
Right.
That the I think that and that there are lots of aspects of this debate right around working from home and around the continuing impacts of COVID and all those sorts of things. And of course, we're talking about organisations which tend to be underfunded. There's very little support infrastructure. Often you have got lots of home working. People are working long hours. People are very kind of mission oriented and therefore prone to burnout and working on quite difficult issues. And of course, many of those factors are common to non-profits in a range of sectors and indeed to SMEs in the for-profit sector. But I do think that there is a risk of providing that support and care and being very sympathetic and so on, which is necessary and important, but sometimes losing the focus on the need to provide a bit of challenge and stretch as well.
Right.
And yeah, I think it's a balance that it constantly needs to be watched out for, isn't it? Because of course, many people in this space will be very driven and therefore self-motivated and on the edge of burnout and require people to hold them back from that.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's particularly the case in smaller organisations. Perhaps as they grow, and you get to your kind of 100 plus, headcount, then maybe there's more room for larger teams where you've got more more scope not to be really kind of pulling your weight, more risk of duplication and so on. I think perhaps it's even more important in those sorts of organizations than it is for smaller startups, but it certainly seems to be a shared concern about how do you get that balance right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does really resonate with our listeners. Yeah, it's a topic that comes up quite a lot when I'm speaking with CEOs and chairs, to be honest. And it's fascinating really to get your take on that. I guess looking ahead, what's next for you and what's the vision for the Fairness Foundation in the coming years?
So, I mean, we talked a bit about what we're trying to achieve and how we measure that as well. So, in terms of our goals, we are looking to persuade politicians in the UK that inequality is a problem, should be a policy priority. And I think, ideally we wouldn't exist in 10 years' time because we would have changed the extent to which that is seen as a priority. And that really is the yardstick of our success, is that the conversation around that at the kind of political policy level has changed. And that we don't therefore need to be constantly talking about it and pushing particular policy solutions because they will be under consideration anyway.
Right.
And even if we can't achieve that to the extent that we no longer need to exist within a certain time frame, I do think that it makes sense for the sort of organisation that we are, that we stay small and catalytic and try to achieve change by working with partners and identifying opportunities to kind of recruit partners who have particular skill sets and focus areas and constituencies and so on to work with us in ways that match their core competencies, rather than us trying to grow and do those things ourselves, whether that's around research or lobbying or detailed policy work, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's really about how do we change that conversation. As I say, this idea of if we could do one thing over the next 10 years, I'd love to really kind of torpedo this idea that we live in a meritocracy, because I think we may not be able to disagree about whether we should live in a meritocracy, but if we can all agree that we don't live in one, I think that would have a huge impact on the kind of conversations we are having around poverty, inequality, benefits, tax, and so on.
I think it's a big and necessary vision, really, and one that many people in the sector will want to connect into, and be a part of those conversations, in the years to come. So, well, it's been a real pleasure to hear your thoughts and hear about your work, and I really appreciate all your honesty and your clarity. To learn more about the Fairness Foundation, or look at your reports and your campaigns. We'll definitely get all your material in the show notes. Is there anything particular that you want to get across to our listeners at this stage before we say thanks for joining us?
I think just to say that I think fairness can be a useful tool for lots of organizations to think about, both in terms of how they think about how to design their own strategies, but also how to communicate their their missions to their stakeholders, whether that's people they're trying to convince or funders or clients, user groups, etc. And so, do look at the website fairnessfoundation.com and our resources, and hopefully some of our thinking around how you can define and communicate fairness will be a useful tool for some of your listeners.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Well, if you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Charity Champions and share it with someone who you think might take some value from our discussion today. So, Will, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure, and hopefully we'll keep in touch.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, Emily. Cheers.
Thanks, Will.